introduce the panel. I'm Claire Petrie, the former Energy and Water Ombudsman in New South Wales. Cassandra Goldie, who will wave at you, the CEO of ACOS, and Andrew Richards, the CEO of the Energy Users Association of Australia. Just in opening, before we hand it over to you, the panel has received disclosures from 20 signatories to the Energy Charter, and we've discussed these disclosures with 19 of those CEOs. The purpose of this forum is to hear from you as consumers and consumer representatives, to hear to what extent your experience mirrors the disclosures during 2020. We have people from the energy companies at this forum, but they won't be speaking. But it's still very valuable for them to hear directly from their stakeholders. So just to recap, and I'm sorry if this is going over old ground for you, but just to recap that the Energy Charter was launched in January 2019, so we are now into the second year of the Charter. And in signing up to the Charter, the signatories have committed to 5 principles. We will put customers at the centre of our business and the energy system. We will improve energy affordability for customers. We will provide energy safely, sustainably and reliably. We will improve the customer experience, and we will support customers facing vulnerable circumstances. And each principle is to be fulfilled through 24 more detailed principles in action. So the signatories to the Charter represent energy sector businesses across Australia and across the supply chain. So there's generation, transmission, distribution and retailers, both gas and electricity, and government-owned, privately owned and hybrid ownership are all represented among the signatories to the Charter. Following the first year, this year, the panel asked the signatories to really focus their disclosures to provide a realistic and transparent warts and all response. We didn't want to see a public relations document or hear about actions that signatories have to undertake in any case, for example, through rules or law or regulation. We asked them to tell us how they went above and beyond the have-to requirements, including implementing the recommendations from the 2019 IAP report, how they measured any progress since their 2019 disclosures, and how the Better Together initiatives were working. So generally, the CEOs have acknowledged that there's still a way to go in their companies becoming truly customer-centric in their culture, approach, and systems. But in the panel wanting to hear from you about perhaps the not so good, it's important to acknowledge the good. As we discussed with the CEOs, 2020 has been an unprecedented year with energy companies and their customers facing natural disasters, fire, flood, hail, drought, and then the COVID pandemic. Companies went above and beyond in keeping the power on, restoring it after infrastructure was burned out or flooded, providing generators where supply couldn't be restored quickly. They moved large numbers of staff to working from home without interruption of service and worked hard to keep their field staff safe and working. Many companies proactively stopped disconnections before they were required to. In our 19 meetings, the CEOs have shown a strong commitment to the Charter and have welcomed the independent review by the panel. They've also acknowledged the importance of the Better Together initiatives on the basis that some problems can't be resolved in isolation and need combined action and shared knowledge. The panel's final report will be published on the 4th of December 2020, after we've completed our meetings with the CEOs, stakeholder forums, and received public submissions. Just before we turn the meeting over to you, it's worth us foreshadowing some of the themes that are emerging from the disclosures and our discussions with these CEOs. The first is in relation to Principle 1. We'll put customers at the centre of our business and the energy system. We're looking at how this principle is actually embedded in each company, from the board and executive level all the way through to the frontline staff. What customer metrics are in place to measure customer satisfaction and pain points? How far does cultural change go beyond the words? We'll be interested in your experience here, particularly if you're a member of a customer consultative group. In the current COVID environment and economic downturn, we're particularly concerned about principles 2 and 5 that deal with energy affordability and customers in vulnerable circumstances. So I'm going to pass to Cassandra Goldie just to talk very briefly about this theme that's emerging from our work this year. Cass.
Thanks, Claire. So it's Cassandra Goldie, CEO from ACOS, and I'm here on Gadigal land this morning. And just picking up from Claire there, in the meetings that we've had with the CEOs, there's a few things that we've been particularly questioning. One is about the extent to which the interests and voices of customers who are particularly vulnerable is embedded within either the boardroom or at the senior level of the organisation in terms of direct access to the executive or the board. The second area is on principle 2, which is around affordability. Of course, this ongoing question about to what extent there are systems in place, proactive systems to ensure that customers are getting access to all of the supports to which they're entitled when it comes to reducing their energy bills. And to what extent the signatories are driving more action to give access to energy efficiency measures or access to distributed energy measures, again with a focus on people on lower incomes who particularly they're at greater risk of being left behind with those kinds of initiatives. And sort of the question of scale, you know, there's lots of discussion about trials, and the third area I just wanted to highlight was of course, many of the signatories have said that the stabilising arrangements that were put in place in the COVID context, for example, the moratoriums on disconnections, the income support measures, many of those are not at the moment planned to continue. And of course, the huge risk of a tsunami, you know, coming in terms of lack of affordability and the risk for very vulnerable households associated with that. So to what extent has there been active planning put in place to address what is definitely coming? The risk of sort of serious debt being accumulated. We've seen that work that came out during the week. And to what extent data analytics are being used to actually identify customers who are getting into serious trouble, because we know that there are many people who have not had experience in accessing any supports in the past. So there's a number of things I just thought I'd flag up there, Claire. Of course, there'll be other areas that you'll be very keen to bring to our attention, but there's some of the themes so far. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Cass. And another theme that has emerged as a major one this year in terms of principle 3, we'll provide energy safely, sustainably and reliably. It's emerged, energy sustainability has emerged as a theme this year. So Andrew will talk briefly about that.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Thanks, everyone. And it's great to see you all. State governments in particular are moving ahead with net zero emissions targets by 2050, or in some cases earlier than that. That obviously creates a challenge for energy industry participants who need to make investment decisions that sometimes last up to 50 years. So a lot of the investments that have been made today will span over well beyond 2050. So energy market participants need to understand the implications of that. And I guess we've been putting to them, how do we manage this transition without actually blowing up the energy system and blowing up consumer bills? Because we don't want to have lots of stranded assets that get written down, and we don't want consumers having to continue to pay for stranded assets like gas pipelines and transmission lines, as an example. So we've had some really interesting discussions, and it's fair to say, and look, I represent a number of large commercial industrial customers, and we have this same conversation with them about what the plans are for net zero by 2050 and how they transition their business. And there's a range of views there and a range of preparedness, if you like. And it's very similar to the energy industry itself. There's a range of views, range of preparedness. Everyone recognises we need to get to a different place, but they're in different stages of transitioning to that. So if you're in a big coal-fired power station, one of your big issues is, how do I actually look after my employees? How do I look after the local communities that rely on this power station moving forward? How do I transition? And also, how do I change the business so I continue to have a business moving forward in this space? If you're a big gentailer, then you've obviously got some different issues associated with managing customer expectations. We've had some really interesting discussions, I must say, though, with people who have a very large, dispersed customer base, and they're looking at remote area power supplies and a whole range of different things that they're doing to keep remote area communities online. And it's a bit of a sandbox on what we might be looking at into the future. So how do we combine technologies and make them work together so that the system can actually still deliver good outcomes for consumers and progressively do that in a lower cost way? So I think through this, and hopefully through the Better Together initiatives, along with these sorts of customer involvements, we actually can transition in a much more seamless way and not leave consumers behind. The last thing we want to see, obviously, are bad decisions being made and customer bills being blown up. So hopefully what you'll see coming out of this is some really positive discussion about how we actually move forward on a net zero emissions by 2050 and transition the entire energy market in a much more sustainable way, perhaps than it's been done before. So I was positive by some of the discussions that we've had that there's a pathway forward. Back to you, Claire.
Thanks, Andrew. So look, now it's over to you to tell us about your experiences, where you've experienced practice and conduct that are consistent with the Energy Charter principles, practices and conduct that are not in alignment with the Charter, best practice examples from other service areas that you deal with, metrics that you think should be used to measure progress against the Charter, and how you think energy companies need to prepare for the potential affordability crisis outlined by Cassandra. Your input is invaluable in the panel critiquing the 2020 disclosures. Just one last issue that has come up, and without wanting to constrain the discussion in any way, it is the role of consumer advocates as a whole. We know there's the huge energy industry on the one hand and consumers and consumer representatives on the other who are very constrained. And so it would be interesting to hear from you about how you cope with representing the interests of energy consumers and what might help you to do as much as you can and support your role. We will be taking, so I'm going to open it up and you can either indicate through the chat room or raising your hand, either physically or on the screen, and I can go to each of you in turn. So who would like to go first? Anyone? I notice, yes, thank you. I think Gareth Downing, I think you might be on mute, Gareth.
I was on mute. I'm not.
Here we are. There we are. Okay. So if when you speak, if you can just say who you are and where you're from.
I'm Gareth Downing. I'm from NCOS. I think I would just like to start. I'd echo Cassandra's concerns. I think certainly what we're seeing is a lot of deferred financial difficulties that are really being pushed out through a lot of the COVID measures. And while a lot of the measures have been really good on the part of industry, and I think industry should be applauded because they really picked up, the real financial risks that were there. They picked those up very early in the piece and put in place programs to really support people through this crisis. It's the tail end of the crisis and transitioning into next year where we think we're going to see a lot more people fall into financial difficulties. And I think that's been echoed through pretty much everyone that I've talked to about energy, and not just energy, beyond energy. That's really where the areas of concern are. I think the other thing I'd like to say is on Andrew's point earlier, talking about transitioning the energy system and sustainability. I think in some ways it's kind of an odd world that we're now in, because energy generators and retailers appear to be leading the sustainability conversation. You know, it's been a very long time coming, but in many respects, industry is aware of the issues and is genuinely considering the issues in a more serious way than parts of the government are. I know in New South Wales, we've got a very proactive government who's looking at, you know, the transition pathway for sustainable energy into the future. And I think that's something that it's very positive, but then how that interacts with national settings is becoming a bit of a difficult issue, because we have sort of local reliability settings that are being looked at and energy sustainability targets are being looked at. And it's not clear at all how that's really going to work with the work coming out of the Energy Council from COAG, or what was COAG. So yeah, there's a lot more work to be done in that space. And I think I would echo what Andrew had said about, you know, communities do expect energy retailers and generators to have a plan to support the communities in which they're based at the moment. And I think that's a very, very significant challenge. What we don't want to be seeing at all is what we saw in the automotive industry, where, you know, there's sudden rapid pull out of an area, massive unemployment, and no real plan to help people transition. And I think, you know, there is scope to manage this a lot better by having plans around retraining, upskilling people who are younger into roles that might be ongoing. But there's certainly a lot more that can be done there, and that's something that, you know, is very important going forward. But I'll stop at this point and let other people speak.
Gareth, before we do, could you just talk some more about, in acknowledging that there may be a debt crisis coming and that it's been handled well to date, what does happen when all that government support is gone and people are maybe in no better position to pay their energy bills or other bills than they were before? What do we need to do collectively and in terms of the energy companies themselves?
Yeah, so there are a few things. I mean, the most obvious thing that would be fantastic is if we could get New Start to Job Seeker to be raised. I mean, that's really the major component of solving that problem. But there are going to have to be, you know, consideration about how part payment is managed, how we extend out some of the hardship processes that have been in place, you know, the support. I mean, I know that certainly in the water space, there's been analytics being done to help identify people who might be at risk of not paying in advance, to make sure that they can be, you know, flagged as, you know, do you need hardship assistance? So they're actually starting to look at the markers of people who are in financial trouble before they are in financial trouble, to help them manage their payments. So there are certainly things like that that can be done. I mean, ultimately, you know, there are kind of, and I know work's been done on this past, there are kind of two categories of people who don't pay their bills. There are people who can't pay because they have very little financial capacity, and then there's another group of people who don't want to pay. And the don't want to pay portion of the population is actually very small. That's not most people. Most people really do want to pay their bills, and they're finding it very, very hard. So it's providing that cohort of people support. And I mean, unfortunately, the unemployment outlook is not good into next year. It's probably going to be worse than it is now, and we'll see quite a lot of people go into unemployment. It's, you know, looking to be north of 8%, and a lot of the people who will be losing work will be in sort of precarious employment as it is now. So they're already in casualized industries, and so there'll be quite a lot of risks for those people.
Do you have a sense of what those markers are that companies could be looking for in advance?
Yeah, I mean, I think from recollection, I know that Sydney Water has done a lot of work on this, and the way in which they were looking at it was by essentially looking at the timeframes that people were using for payment, and the when there was an overdue payment, what those dates were. So they're looking at sort of usage and expenditure data, and also the delay or deferral in payment. And they started to build profiles where they could say, you know, if someone has missed payment for this, you know, on multiple occasions for this amount of time, usually not particularly long periods of time, like 10 days, that was because they were waiting for their income support payment, or they were waiting for, you know, their next check to come through so they could make their payments.
Thank you. Would anyone like to take that up or make other comments?
Claire, I'd be... Mari, I think you're on mute, Mari. I'd be interested to understand whether we're seeing new classes or new groups of people coming into this sort of vulnerable space, Gareth, or others. I mean, we seem to have a classification about what a vulnerable customer looks like, but is that changing? Is that starting to look like something different?
I think so. I think it's gotten a lot bigger than it was. I think what is vulnerable has changed massively. There are a lot of people who, and this is kind of where it gets beyond sort of the traditional group that we think of, who are, in extreme need, who are under substantial financial pressure. But we're actually starting to see there are other people, in New South Wales, where it is, it's the mortgage belt. They're also facing financial pressures because, hours are down. We're starting to see underemployment go up. So even if you don't lose a job, if you're losing shifts, that can be a really significant financial pressure for people. So that's the other side to it, where we're starting to see groups you wouldn't traditionally think of being, under financial stress, starting to experience quite high rates of financial stress. And the data that we have on that is actually reasonably good. I mean, census asks questions every 4 years, but we've got pretty good financial stress indicator data by region. And then that will tell you where you would be looking for people who are experiencing financial stress. I know, off the top of my head, that it's kind of in Sydney, it's Campbelltown, it's Fairfield, it's Bankstown. These are the places that are experiencing really high rates of financial stress, to name a few.
It's I'm just interested if any of you would like to identify which signatories or particular parts of the industry may be doing anything that you can see that is proactive on this front. I think the analogy on, over at Sydney Water is really helpful. Are any of you seeing any of the companies proactively putting these kinds of analytics in place? The proactive engagement being on the front foot in a systemic way.
I mean, I'm certainly aware of initiatives around extending hardship assistance. I'm not as aware of, because I don't have necessarily those contacts. I'm relatively new to this space and I don't engage with people in industry as much. So I'm not familiar with specific analytics being done, but I am aware that it has been done in other industries before. So I think it's something that's probably is occurring. I'm just not aware of it.
Anybody else able to comment on those particular aspects of sort of affordability and vulnerability? I think the theme is a big one, Gareth. I, completely agree with you. It's not like you've got to go searching for the big picture data on this, but it's about what the companies specifically are doing with their access to data and the triggers that could engage, them further in, being communications, other strategies with customers rather than reactive approaches.
I think Jess Harrison would like to say something. Jess, where are you?
Hi, so I'm calling in from Cadigal Wangelland in Sydney, and I can speak a bit to what you're saying, Cassandra. So I represent the Sydney Alliance, the Voices for Power campaign. So some of you guys have heard of us, but basically we're a diverse coalition of volunteers from culturally and linguistically diverse communities across Sydney, but largely new migrant communities of colour based out of Western Sydney. So for our leaders, sort of the catch cry for our campaign is clean and affordable energy for all. And the reason that I bring that up is echoing what we're talking about, that for our communities, the affordability question and the sustainability question, it's inextricable. You can't separate the two. So some of the, I guess, the roadmap that we have on how to achieve this is a couple ask mainly a solar garden in Western Sydney. So that's responding to a lot of stories, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, the health issues and the safety issues that come from living in Western Sydney, which can, get in the high 40s in the summer, and all of the fumes and the lack of the cool. It's a heat sink, which obviously isn't new to anyone here. And the massive affordability question that comes from trying to cool homes in the summer and heat homes in winter. We have a leader who's of Indian background who says that throughout winter in his Western Sydney home out by Parramatta, the tip of his hands are blue for months on end because he can't afford to heat his home. We have stories of at the last bushfire season, young people in their early 20s being hospitalized from health issues from heat, and also from all of the smoke and the gunk that was in the air at the same time. But so the reason I bring that up is what we found that the energy companies have done, which is really responding to these stories, I guess these stories rather than analytics. That might just be a little bit of a difference in how we organize. But we just wanted to applaud, like, energy companies are funding a program called Train the Trainer with us, which is a program that will train leaders of these communities, of these new migrant communities, to deliver training to their peers, to help empower culturally diverse people as energy consumers. So these trainings are going to be held in language, using culturally accessible, I guess, content and methods and things like that. And that was really responding to the cumulative disadvantage and also disconnection that a lot of culturally diverse leaders said that they experience in relating to the energy market. You have people who don't speak English as a first language, and they don't know how to read their bills. My colleague Thuy, who's of Vietnamese background, she would have to translate her bills for her parents, and without translating that, the parents just pay whatever number they read. I've heard stories from international students who are subletters, and they just get emails from their landlord with the number of what they're meant to pay for the energy bill. And over COVID, that number's getting higher and higher and higher, and they don't know why, and they don't even have access to seeing these energy bills at all. So I wanted to just praise the energy companies for funding this Train the Trainer program and for their support for our campaign, but also take a bit of time to speak to those stories. And I think we can't really separate the principles of affordability and green power, because if we address them as different things, Western Sydney is going to get hotter and hotter. There's going to be more and more heat waves from burning more coal, and those who are already vulnerable consumers are going to be even more vulnerable, especially coming out of COVID. So I hope that sort of answered your question, Cassie. I'm happy to take questions from the group or like to share more stories if people are interested. But yeah, I think that program specifically is something really proactive that the energy companies are supporting us do, and would love to see other places sort of take that on.
Jess, thank you. That's really helpful, because one of the points that we've obviously discussed with the companies is that you can't put customers at the centre of the business unless you know who your customers are, and just understanding the various groups. And one of the groups that we worry that are invisible are people of different cultural backgrounds where language may be an issue. So they may be invisible and not engaged with the companies. So do you think your model is the best way of reaching the CALD communities?
So I think, the model that the Sydney Alliance operates on is called broad-based relational community organizing, which is an absolute mouthful, so I'm sorry about that. But essentially the model that we operate on, it centers relationships and it centers storytelling. So all of our volunteers are able to, essentially, they're able to feel safe for us to share these stories within a deeply multicultural setting, because we've put in the time to get to know each other and share those stories and build those relationships. So in that way, I think having that really that deeply people-centered and deeply empowering approach is, in my opinion, the best way to give rise to these stories, and also to help people realize that they're not alone. That's been a really powerful part of at least my involvement in Voices for Power is, you know, even we're on Zoom and it's a little bit isolating. People we're able to share these stories, we're able to hear each other. And I'm a staff member of the Alliance, and me and my colleagues alongside these volunteer leaders from sharing these stories feel empowered to meet with MPs and distill these stories into asks and things like that. So that's, I haven't directly answered your question, but again, I think if we're engaging with vulnerable people and diverse people, you know, getting caught up in stats and data and things like that, it doesn't feel very real. I think if we give people the space to feel safe to tell their story, and to just make people feel like they're not alone, I think that's a much more effective way to change the hearts and minds, to do cultural change within energy companies. You know, I think it's that classic quote of, you know, facts don't move people, stories move people.
Jess, if I could, it's Cass, just to pick up on that and invite any other comments as well. The issue of the resourcing and support for the kind of community collaborative approaches that you are one of the great examples of is a question. And have you seen any acceleration by charter signatories of providing resources and support for that work outside of the company environment? Because as you say, it's got to be, you know, there is a power in that kind of approach which cannot be replicated from the big system analysis that companies are able to do. But given the scale of what we are facing here, you know, my view is we can't stay with these being small trials. You know, it has to, there is a significant issue that's here now and only going to grow. And are you seeing the sort of resourcing for that kind of approach accelerate?
Okay, so just to unpack that, there's the question of scaling up this approach, and then there's, I guess, the question of putting resources to these types of programs. So in terms of scaling up, I think, you know, programs like this where like I'm able to speak on behalf of the people that I represent, like creating these forums is really important. I think in terms of the Sydney Alliance, we operate in Sydney, obviously, but if there was similar groups in other cities, I think getting in contact with them is the easiest way to uplift these stories. But also, I think the stories that I'm telling you now are not unique to Sydney. I think you could be pretty safe that these are experiences of new migrant communities in almost every major urban centre in the city. Just replace Western Sydney with North Melbourne, things like that. But I guess but we are quite limited in the scale of what we do. So that's why I guess I come here and just like share the stories, like take it away and ask people to share their stories in your own organizations. I think everyone can take that on board. In terms of resourcing of essentially, are you asking other projects like this being resourced? Is that sort of what you're?
Yeah, if we see that this is something that is extremely valuable for companies, and companies are wanting to open up community engagement and be able to hear more from customers.
Bless you.
Support, excuse me, for that happening at a scale that you would like to see.
Sorry, you cut out there just towards the end. Sorry, my internet's a bit patchy.
Is the support for this kind of community engagement there within companies? What I've seen in the past is they're small, it's a little bit of money, and it gets stuck, you know, and you don't actually get it to be more broad-based, and we don't move beyond what would be considered trials or small-scale support for this kind of work.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we're amongst family here. Getting the funding for this program was pulling teeth, you know, like this was years of work to be able to get this program funded. And a lot of the time, my salary is based off a grant, which is quite a piecemeal approach. We're seeing a lot of specific allocations of money for projects that go for very short durations, which for anyone who works in the human services or community development sector knows it's not very effective. So I think the companies can be doing a lot more to put their money where their mouth is and actually support these programs, and to also fund the training of people in secure work to be able to implement this, because with that also, I guess, speaks to other experiences of vulnerability people are feeling with the gig economy and that type of casualized work. So the short answer is no, there's not a lot of resourcing. Yes, I think there could be a lot more.
Yes, do you think that could be an opportunity for the industry to perhaps partner with governments to create that more longevity in funding pool for people like yourself to do more of this good work?
Yeah.
Could that be a recommendation?
Could that be what, sorry?
It does seem to be a great way. I mean, the best way to avoid a big bill is to be more efficient, to understand it better, and all those sorts of things that you've talked about. And governments continually talk about the need for energy industry to step up and do things. And I think perhaps there's a role there for government to perhaps partnership with industry to help on this.
Yeah, I find my experience of working with government is the higher tier up you get, the more they're sort of like passing the responsibility to someone else, right? So I've worked with quite a few local councils, like local government areas across Sydney, and they're doing incredible work. Like a lot of the on the ground, they're the foot soldiers of this stuff. They're the ones rolling out all the energy efficiency. And in places like Strata, where it's really difficult to get, getting energy audits for aged care facilities that are very high off-peak energy users, stuff like that. When you get up to state, it's a little bit harder. And then when you get up to federal, it's near impossible to even have this on the cards as a conversation topic. So yeah, I'd love to see more collaboration between the private sector and government in terms of pooling resources, and I guess pooling human resources with that as well, because at the moment, I think a lot of us experience this, that the civil society sector is sometimes trying to act as a bridge between the places with the money, being private sector and government. So I'd love to be able to see that collaboration happen, definitely.
Yes, I think there's a just transition story here that's probably not being told well enough. When we talk about the transition of energy systems, it's about what are we going to invest in and what's the next technology, and let's support, sort of some whiz bang thing we can plug in. A big part of it is, well, not everyone can afford the big whiz bang thing we can plug in to save energy or to batteries or whatever. So there's a group of people that we need to make sure don't get left behind in this.
100%.
If governments are putting policy in place, then they need to take responsibility for all of the outcomes of that policy, which includes making sure we don't leave people behind.
Definitely. Like I was in a meeting recently, and an older woman of Filipino background asked the question of, like, she lives in social housing, and she has a gas stove. And she asked, when we transition, do I have to get a new stove? Like, what's going to happen to my stove? We're not talking about transition to individual people, but it's still up here in lofty policy and talking about investments. And obviously that's important, but we need to anchor it in the lived experiences of people. And I'd argue that, rather than government being like, oh, have we made sure we're not leaving anyone through the cracks? Start from the bottom, like tailor policies directly to the people who are excluded from our energy market at the moment, and then build it from there, and do that in a way, like you're saying, with the just transition centered at every step of the way. No, I totally agree with you.
Thank you, Jess. I wondered whether there is anyone here from rural or regional areas of New South Wales who might comment on special needs of consumers in your area. Margaret.
Murray Russell here. Oh, Margaret.
So who did I miss out?
No, Murray's got a hand up, so I'll let her talk first.
Okay. Murray?
Well, I was just wondering about the rural industry. I mean, they did it tough for quite a few years with the drought, and charities were extremely good. Margaret there from CWA and her organisation, and I'm a member. They are absolutely fantastic. St Vincent de Paul and the Salvation Army. I think a lot of that funding's dried up, and I was just wondering if there are they in difficulty with their payment of bills, because there's not a lot of stock left out here, and the stock is just red hot. They can't buy them to restock with. And those who have got stock, it costs them a lot of money to keep them alive. Some people got into a lot of debt, like over $1 million plus, feeding stock for 4 years, hoping to hang on because they knew what was going to happen at the end. And some of those eventually trade their way out of it, I would imagine. But I was just wondering if there's any information, whether it's been, any surveys have been done recently. They have had a lot of support in the past, but as I said, that's a lot of that isn't there now. The other thing was, I might, if I'm able, if I could just follow up on some with some Indigenous people. I have a meeting later this week involving Indigenous people, because they certainly would have done it very hard with the drought, because, as we know, the river's dried up as well, but we've got water now. But in these western towns out here, no water, no activity, and that's when the problem starts. So I might be able to get back to you with a bit more information later in the week about regional Aboriginals and how COVID and the drought impacted on them. So yes, I was just wondering if there is any information about landholders, and I know the mental health mental health issues have increased, not just with landholders but small business in general, topped up with COVID now. For sure it's increased. There's 16 rural adversity mental health workers across the state, and they're flat out. I'm involved with the Centre for Rural and Remote Mental Health in Orange. I actually chair that advisory, and I do. It has, and there is a lot of pressure on.
So, Murray, can you just clarify? So you're around the Orange area, are you? Where?
No, the Centre for Rural and Remote Mental Health around Orange. I'm a grazier on the Darling River at Tilpa, and I was right in the middle of that drought. I was in it for 4 years myself.
Okay.
I don't have any stock because I had to let them go. The cost of feeding them was just outrageous and a lot and inaccessible for a lot of people too, because it just wasn't there, and what was there was very expensive. So I cashed all my stock last year. But I'm involved in Orange with the Centre for Rural and Remote Mental Health because I chair the New South Wales Advisory Committee, and we have a lot of people, there's a couple of people from here. CWA, for instance, they're a member of that. So we've got some great organisations, New South Wales Farmers and other people, and they've actually done work with currently doing work with Essential Energy as well.
What sort of work?
That's mainly with staff, I think, with their mental health policy.
Okay, yep, gotcha. So Margaret, Bruce, would you like to say something? You're from the Country Women's Association, I think.
I certainly am, Country Women's Association of New South Wales. And as Murray was saying, we have helped a lot of people. We've had donated to us up to quite a few $1 million. That's allowed us to hand out $18 million in grants. CWA hasn't raised all that money. A lot of the money's coming from larger organisations due to the fact is that the way CWA could handle about handing out these grants, they were for household grants that needed to be, bills that needed to be paid. And what I wanted to say was a lot of it was related to electricity bills, phone bills and etc. We didn't offer any payment for stock or feed or large fuel or anything like that. It was strictly for household and children and families to even get around with petrol and so on. I don't know the exact, so what I was just trying to say was when we're looking about people having difficulties. Well, of course they were having difficulties and they still will for quite some time, as Mari's also stated. Even though the drought might be relieved with some of the rain that we've had, but that doesn't actually mend all the damage that's been done over the many years that the drought did its trouble with us. So yes, rural people are still struggling, and it's not people just on properties, it's homeowners in the towns of those country rural areas as well. So I'd just like to leave that there. Thank you.
So what do you think, Margaret, about the issue that the worst may still be to come as these grants finish and other supports fall away?
Well, our grants are gradually finishing. We're not getting as much donated now towards the drought like we were. We're expecting another few $100,000 coming in. Once that's eliminated, life will be back to normal for us. People are still struggling and trying to cover, and work will be difficult to get. Well, I shouldn't say that, because a lot of the farmers at this stage, a lot of the properties are having problem getting staff to come in, help with picking their produce, and also even grain workers and other staff relating to that. Whether people can't afford to travel to the country areas, but when usually they're working on a property, they get their accommodation and obviously supplemented with food. I'm on the mid-north coast. We don't have a drought problem to the degree out west had, but even our local avocado business here in the mid-north coast, they're having trouble getting pickers and so on. They're getting a lot of the backpackers, of course, because backpackers can't move around, but just getting back to people will be struggling in the rural areas to cover their costs for quite some time because of unemployment and etc.
Margaret and Mary, if I can ask both of you whether you've seen any of the energy companies participating in some of the more community-based work that you're doing, and any of your views about what more needs to be done there. We're very conscious of the issues of the mental health of communities are really serious, yeah. And often the receipt of the energy bill can be a really triggering event for people, because it can often be the one that tips you over in terms of, you know, a sense of crisis. So are you seeing the engagement with the companies, anything that you think is missing in action in terms of the energy companies associated with how to respond to this level of vulnerability in rural areas?
Well, as Marie said, I'm with the Essential Energy Community Advocacy Group, and they're doing a wonderful job. They're helping where they can in certain areas, and some of our people that I've spoken to that have had, especially during the fires, the response there was fantastic. Or well, some people still complain anyway. You're always going to get that anywhere. But as far as people do complain about the cost of their electricity, of course, and I know that's what this is all about, to try and resolve that area. I don't know to the extent of what other groups, other electricity companies are actually doing regarding putting forward the issues of helping financially or helping with mental health and etc. So maybe Marie, because she's more involved with individual groups than what I am. You got something more, Marie? Mari?
And I might get back to you with a bit more information if, yeah, I'm not on mute. After, later in the week, if that's okay with you, Cassandra.
But Cassandra, I think that's something I can also look into and maybe come back to you further on that a bit further down the track.
Well, I think in terms of process, it would be great to receive anything in writing that you can, And Mara, you know, post your meeting later in the week, even if there's short notes, rough notes, doesn't have to be a, you know, full-blown policy submission or anything. You know, everybody is really flat strapped. We understand that. So if there's anything that you can feed through by further email, Claire, as I understand it, that process is completely fine. And we'd love to get anything further from you. The stories are very powerful. Both the good, bad, and, you know, if it's really, you know, something that you want to alert us to, because we are meeting again with the signatories before the end of this process. And so there are things that we can raise with them if you would like us to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just on that.
Sandra, if I just may,
Yeah, no, go.
If yeah, I'd just like to say that there has been a lot of federal funding also for the industry, helping with freight subsidies over the last few years when it was so bad. So, but anybody that's out of drought now, they're not eligible for any of that funding, but they've had some very good assistance from the federal government, that's for sure.
And so, Murray,
with interest subsidies, but I was just wondering.
Are you highlighting that we've got sort of this multiple layer effect of where supports that were offered are now starting to run out on a whole number of fronts in the bush?
Well, it is. I think some of it's running out with federal government. If you're not drought declared and you've had the rain, but you may not have the stock and you may not be getting up and running again, and because you can't afford to. I think that's going to be a big issue, because I can drive for hundreds of kilometres around here and not see a sheep or cattle, a head of cattle. And I've done a fair bit of tripping around right out to the corner and Chipperborough and Millprinker and places like that. But no, I was just wondering if there was any, if there was a huge difficulty with the rural industry affording bills. That's what started it all. But I'll get back to you with a bit more information.
Thank you, Mari and Margaret. And just on the point, to reinforce what Cassandra said, the panel submissions are open till the end of this month, but we're really happy to just receive an email or a comment or a story. It doesn't have to be a long and formal submission. We just want intelligence from you about what's working, where the gaps are, what maybe needs more work in terms of those principles that we've talked about. So anything that you can provide would be very helpful to our critique of the disclosures. So thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. No, that's all good. Thank you very much, Claire.
No. Who else would like to say something or contribute to the discussion? I'm just looking to see if anyone has their hand up or would like to make a comment. Gareth, back to you.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to pick up on...
Can you just move slightly closer to the microphone, Gareth?
I'm a bit quiet. I speak very quietly.
Yes, I can't hear Gary.
Times. Yeah, sorry about that. I also wanted to pick up another issue, which is we think a lot about the accessibility issues and the challenges of accessing supports. And I just wanted to echo that in regional and rural areas, another element to this is a lot of the programs where you get financial support are provided online. And that is not always accessible or reliably accessible. So when considering sort of the consumer-centric design sort of side to it, it's useful for energy companies to keep in mind that you might not be able to maintain connectivity for 10 minutes to fill in a 10-page form. That's something that I've certainly been hearing a lot, not so much in the context of energy, but certainly with respect to income support payments. It's something we hear all the time. If you're eligible for sort of farm assistance allowances, or if you're living in a remote town, that it can be quite difficult to get income support because you're relying on either a very unstable satellite connection, or you have to try and travel to the local Centrelink office, which is hundreds of kilometres away. And when you don't have very much income, that's really, really challenging. So that's kind of another dimension to it. I mean, it's not as great of an issue in New South Wales, I think, but there certainly across the country, it can be really, really challenging for people to access the support they need, particularly if they're provided purely online. So that's just something to keep in mind when looking to design programs for support.
That is a good point. And just on that, we hear from the companies themselves that they know, and I'm sure you will support this, that there are many people, customers who are entitled to all sorts of concessions who actually aren't getting them. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a real problem. I know that in New South Wales, there's been there was a suggestion flagged in the most recent Productivity Commission Green Paper from New South Wales Productivity Commission that they would review concessions so that it could be done, that all concessions could effectively be applied via Service New South Wales. And in doing so, that would kind of simplify the process, because you would put in your information once and then it would just be applied, and you wouldn't have multiple processes to go through for different organizations and companies. They would sort it out for you. That recommendation was made recently, but that review obviously hasn't been formalized. So that might be something that happens in the future, where there might be scope to simplify arrangements to really support people. But in the interim, yeah, it's kind of strange, but paper forms are still very, very useful for people, particularly older Australians who don't use the internet nearly as much. That's the other kind of group that gets caught out quite a lot. Got about 50% in internet take up among people over 65.
Thank you.
That's a really interesting point, Gareth, because it's one of the charter principles is to putting customers at the centre, and that means all groups of customers, and not just assuming that everyone's tech savvy. It also assumes that everyone's happy to just be on the phone, when really a lot of people value is actual that one-to-one customer service, or dealing with them in a way that they're used to. I mean, we've heard from a number of signatories about they go out in person to hand people a notice of disconnection. Not that they're not disconnecting, but it's a notice of disconnection. And these people are actually seeing an 80% reduction in the amount of disconnection, simply because there's a personal interaction. And I just wonder, sometimes there's a whole thing about efficiency, but I think sometimes it also gets lost in maybe a reduction in customer service. I'm just wondering, are we moving too far in one direction around the efficiency side, and actually losing a lot of value with those interactions?
I mean, I think the efficiency, I think it's not necessarily a trade-off, in the sense that, most people who have an interaction with their energy supplier don't have any issues. It's usually a pretty smooth process. Technology has made it an incredibly smooth process compared to what it was 20, 30 years ago. So the opportunity for companies is really to take the resources they're saving from not, having to talk to me on the phone to connect me, or to resolve a bill issue because I'm emailing. It's to take the resources that they're saving and reinvest them into the people that really need that support. And so when those savings are made, it does allow for companies to put more money into, outreach to people who are particularly vulnerable, whether that's coal communities, whether or not that's people who are over a certain age who are finding it really hard to deal with changes in payment processes. I mean, changes in payment processes sometimes for people who are really elderly, it's just so challenging. When you're 80 something years old and you don't have a computer and you don't use the internet, and your local bank has shut because branches are shutting, and your local post office is shut, and that's where you used to pay your bills, it becomes harder and harder for people to pay their bills. And I think that's part of the problems that we're starting to see, is there's a cohort of people who, and they're also uncomfortable going outside at the moment, which is understandable. So it's kind of this compounding problem of people who have very little options to make payments, and that's a cohort that I think probably needs additional support. And even things like sending them more letters more frequently probably would help. And providing opportunities for them to actually change payment processes, because it's certainly been something that we've seen in the past crop up as an issue. And at the moment, I think it's probably a big issue, because people don't want to, if they're above a certain age, they don't want to be out in the community.
It sounds like you've met my mum, Gareth. She's exactly as you described. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and that's exactly it. I mean, it's my grandmother. It's, you know, it's my mum as well. You know, she doesn't want to be going out. I mean, she's in her 60s. She doesn't want to be going outside. She doesn't use online banking. My dad does, but you know, there's a whole generation of people who are very uncomfortable and obviously, you know, need a little bit of additional support and will pay if they can change that or make those adjustments.
Gareth, is that cohort, is their main connection with their energy provider then by phone?
I think quite often it is. And then that leads into another issue, which is a lot of them, and that creates elements of cost as well and disadvantage, because a lot of the people who are using traditional telephone services, the cost of traditional telephone services have gone up massively in the last few years. Particularly like a home landline is much more expensive than it was 5 years ago. And that's because it's fewer and fewer people who are using it, and Telstra has effectively a monopoly. And so that's sort of another source of disadvantage. When people on low incomes maintain a landline, they're often paying per minute. So the longer they're waiting on a phone call, the more they're paying. And that's really problematic. A lot of them only get unlimited minutes when they're on much more expensive phone plans, sort of $50 to $70 a month. So, you know, and that seems odd to us because, you know, most people now use a mobile phone instead. But if you're relying on a landline, that's another dimension to the disadvantage that can occur.
So that should be a real case. Sorry, Jess, I'll come to you, but that should be a real case of the companies ringing the customer rather than the customer having to stay on the phone. We heard from a company in Victoria who said that they were assisting customers to fill in the a hardship grant or concession form directly, and it could take up to 40 minutes to fill in. It was quite a piece of paper, but it was worth their time to get the concession right at the beginning, so they didn't have those issues for the customer or affordability issues down the track. So it was an investment worth making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that, you know, and this is kind of the other element to the paperwork around, is that, you know, a lot of the people who are applying for concessions who are in sort of the older age bracket, we know that they're not going to necessarily shift away from being in that category for quite prolonged periods of time. So it is quite an investment. If it's done correct the first time, you know, you're not coming back to it after 12 months or 24 months to try and rectify payment issues. Whereas, you know, for other cohorts, it's a bit different because they, you know, might move around a bit more, or they may move on and off benefits, get a job. And so that cohort, it's a bit trickier. But certainly with older residents, we usually know that they're going to be on payments for a prolonged period of time.
Thank you. Jess, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, it's slightly moving away from talking about the telephone. Also, just I wanted to share another story of, I guess, what the move to these like very like heavily online like energy platforms and phone companies and things like that. It also opens people up to being scammed online and through the phone. Like I've worked with like a Sri Lankan man who's a person seeking asylum, and he does his phone bills through Dodo, which is a fully online phone company, and he's getting really intimidating messages. It was completely a scam. Intimidating messages are telling him his phone bill was overdue and he had to pay it. And there's a lot of people I've worked with who experience similar things with all of this stuff, kind of what Gareth was saying of being moved online. Just they're sharing their personal information a lot more online. It's opening them up to scams, and the scams are very intimidating. They're deeply troubling. They're deeply traumatic, especially what we spoke about before with like the mental health impacts and how this can be triggering getting an energy bill. So I think also something energy companies can be doing is providing a bit more literacy around like identifying what is a scam and what's like a genuine text message from your energy company reminding you that your bill's due. Yeah, because it's something, if you don't speak English as your first language, these types of harassing text messages and emails are really scary.
Thank you. Now, anyone else who would like to make a comment or a contribution? Oh, now Alex.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Alex Bishop. Yes, we can hear you. You're having some trouble with your screen, apparently.
Yeah, I can't seem to get my video working, so I can't put my hand up. And I didn't want to just sort of jump in and cut anybody off. I'm Alex Bishop from the Energy Consumers Australia. Somebody's asked me, I can't start my video. Anyway, sorry, Zoom's pestering me to start my video and I can't do it. I just wanted to just say a few things. I want to echo quite a lot of the comments that have been made, which have been on my list of things to contribute. So it's great that we're all sort of on the same page in terms of voices of the consumers. I just picking up on that point about communication, I did find that, you know, there were in the disclosures, if companies didn't know their customers in the segmentations, they certainly made efforts to get to know them by, you know, reports and consultants this year, which is great because, as somebody said before, if you don't know your customers, you don't know how to deal with them, you don't know how to get the best value for them, you can't, you know, have the best relationship with your consumer. So I found it really interesting that the two different positions, really, the position of the companies who did know the consumers and how they were addressing that, and those who got that work underway. So I did see a few of the companies with some really interesting comments that have been made about following on from those conversations that we've just had about it's not just sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to communication. It's about, you know, taking the time to understand on maybe even a one-to-one basis how customers would like to interact, would like to engage. Not all of them want to be online, and a lot of them have had you know, scams. My mother has been scammed via the phone and the internet, and so she's very nervous about it now. So she's actually changing her preferences away from digital to more on the phone. So I think customer behavior might start, you know, it's not set and forget. So I think companies, you know, do need to understand that customer behavior is changing and that you can't just identify your customers and think you've got it right for each segment in terms of comms. I think it needs to be revisited constantly, and particularly in COVID times. And I did see one of the signatories say, we thought we knew how best to communicate with our customers during these times. Turns out it wasn't necessarily what they wanted. So I think there are a lot of learnings as well around communications with customers, with consumers at this time. And I did sense a willingness from the signatories to take those lessons on board, which I thought was, you know, really helpful and positive to see. I think, so I'm just making some other comments. I think in terms of COVID, you know, I think the report last year from the IAP came out and said, you know, you really need to figure out how you're going to deal with vulnerable customers. And I think COVID then came and provided that real-time use case. And what I found as I was reading all the signatories, and I'm trying to watch all of the CEO meetings, for me, how companies deal with their customers in COVID says it all. It talks to not just about vulnerable people. It talks to, you know, how empathy by the company, talks to internal culture. Because, you know, we see some companies offering training assistance to their staff, particularly around how to deal with pretty dicey situations at home. Also, managing expectations and capabilities of customers, of vulnerable customers, and we've talked about different perspectives and different categorizations of what is vulnerable. And I see also we're seeing leadership. I mean, we're seeing boards and we're seeing CEOs and we're seeing executive management teams stepping up and wanting to be more involved. And I just think that COVID, I mean, my lens was when I read these disclosures, well, how are the companies dealing in these difficult times? This is not a drill. This is actually happening. And to see companies dealing with their customers right now and the learnings that they're taking on board, and the agility of some companies to respond to customers in these difficult times. For me, that says a lot, not just about are they providing deferral of payments and relief, but it actually speaks to their corporate culture as a whole. And so I think that, you know, I'm really impressed with some of the companies in how they're actually embracing this opportunity. There are some that are saying, right, yep, this is providing us the opportunity to really get to know our customers and really to understand and to really get engagement right. They're taking a whole different kind of attitude, and it's usually the smaller ones, and they can. But I see some of the companies really taking it as an opportunity, not just, oh goodness, you know, this is a really tough time, and tough time for our staff, all working from home, tough time for our customers. They're more embracing it as, okay, well, how can we do better? How can we improve our business to embrace this and to really help our customers and our business? And so, you know, I was pretty impressed with some of those disclosures on that front. But for me, how a company is dealing with COVID is it. And I just see the comment, how much of extra effort is actually COVID, and how much, you know, does it actually become BAU? That's exactly what we're looking for. So yeah, great point. But for me, my takeaway was, yeah, they're all doing some great stuff in BAU, and we are looking for how, you know, these programs and these initiatives that are in these disclosures are actually going to be translated. So what will the impact be on customers? That's another lens we're looking at in these disclosures. For me, you know, that the COVID example really demonstrates all of the key points that the panel was looking for in the report. So they're my comments.
Thanks very much, Alex. Very helpful. Andrew, sorry, did you want to say something?
Oh, look, just following up. I mean, we have a lot of conversation with businesses about, you know, what the future of work looks like now, work from home and all those sorts of things. And it's a good point that Alex raised, that and was sort of my sort of statement, that let's make sure we capture all the really good stuff that these guys have done during COVID. And it's not just about throwing money at people. I mean, that's important during these hard times. But how much of the processes and systems and engagement with their customers can we carry over into a business as usual? I mean, stepping it up as they all have. We don't want it to drop back. We want that to ratchet up and set the new level, I think, is what we're looking for. And hopefully that because it has ratcheted up, they got closer to their customers, and that's a massive benefit for everybody. And hopefully that sticks. I think that'll be one of the challenges going forward.
I couldn't agree with you more, particularly as the future of work's never actually going to be the way it was. It won't ever be the same. And so seeing it embedded into practice, I agree. This is an opportunity to do that and actually do well for the customers. And so if they can, you know, put these into the processes and it be, you know, across all levels of the organization, you know, it to be in the, I think one of the companies was talking about it being in the induction materials. It's really embedding it into all of the business, I think is, if this didn't happen, it would be a waste of an opportunity. I think, you know, the time has come to actually embrace, this is the new ways of working. So how can this benefit the customers?
Agreed. That'll be the challenge. So hopefully, and look, I got to say, having spoken to pretty much all the CEOs now, and Claire and Cass, I think they're up for it. I think there's a recognition that this is actually, from an outreach perspective, been quite a good thing, if you can get a good thing out of a bad thing. And perhaps that's one of that silver lining, is to move forward on that new level.
The other thing that's come out for me, and it's something that's been a mantra of mine for a very long time, that the scale of these problems can't be resolved by one individual company. It's really about partnerships, and it goes to partnerships with the Sydney Alliance, partnerships with different players in rural communities, and partnerships between the companies themselves in sharing their knowledge and experience, because they're all facing the same thing. So there's no point in them just working in isolation. And we have been encouraged by the Better Together initiatives. One of the questions for us is has been that we've raised with the CEOs. What are the key initiatives? Are the companies spread a bit too thin? And so that there's some of the issues that we'll also be looking at and talking with the CEOs. Now, we are fast running out of time, so I want to make sure that anyone who wants to say something says it, or what makes a contribution, or wants to ask a question. So is there anything else? There's been a lot of issues raised here today, and they're very, very useful. So is there anyone else who wants to make a comment and make sure they're recorded before we start to wind down? I can't see any hands raised.
Is anybody on here involved in any of the Better Together initiatives? Are any of you? Okay, thanks. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's been really helpful, and we've covered a wide range of issues and given us not only food for thought, but reinforcement of much of our discussion with the CEOs and much of our own thinking. What we would really encourage is that if you can put something in a submission to us, and as we said, it doesn't have to be fancy, it just can be a few simple stories or a few key points that you think the panel really needs to address, issues that have worked well, where you identify gaps for the people that you represent or deal with. So if you can get that to the panel. As Alex Bishop referred to, the interviews with the CEOs are all up on the IAP website, so you can have a look at your energy provider of choice, see what the CEO had to say. But we would very much welcome it. It's so important to hear from consumers and consumer representatives to give that counter view, either in support or not so much in support of where the CEOs are telling us they are at. So we would really welcome that. Cass?
People were keen to know the email for any additional comments. People, what's the best email to send through additional comments?
What an excellent question. We should have had that up on the screen, but it's not.
You go to the Energy Charter Independent Accountability Panel website, there'll be a link there to take.
There we go. Submissions at theenergycharterpanel.com.au.
Yep.
Thank you, Sabine.
Or have a look at our website. There is a lot of information. All the disclosures are there, obviously, all the CEO interviews. We have met with the Energy Ombudsman to get their take on things, and notes from their meeting will also go up on the website. We felt that was a useful counterpoint because they're looking at pain points of customers who make complaints to them. I think they basically said that complaints are down across the board, and I think that also reinforces this view that at the moment, because of all the support that's in place, people are coping, but they share our concern that this won't last once supports start to come away, and that may be reflected in increased complaints. We don't know at this stage. So thank you, everyone. It's been, Andrew, sorry.
I'll just add one more thing. One of the things that the charter signatories are doing is basically a self-ranking approach where they do their own assessment of where they are and what's called a maturity framework. And I'd be really interested to hear from actual consumers and consumer representatives, to the extent that you can, look at those self-ratings from the charter signatories. the ones that you know, and give us your feedback on whether you think that they've rated themselves harshly or they've been a little bit too generous to themselves. So we're trying to get some feedback, some real-time feedback as to where you think they're at as opposed to where they think they're at. Hopefully there's a lot of alignment, but where there isn't, it'd be great to understand that too.
So thanks, Andrew. Cass, do you have any last minute comments?
No, look, I mean, I still think I don't have a great sense that we've got broad scale analysis being done by the companies as a group of what's coming next and whether there is a strong sense of preparedness. So I think picking up on Alex's point about, a lot of what has happened over the last few months has been very instructive about what companies are able to do. We've just got to see whether we've got that now ongoing work happening over the next phase. So I think that's, if there's any additional comments any of you would like to make on that, I'd also really welcome. And, both the, it's always good to highlight good examples of something that's being done. So, do feel free to put that through as well. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, unless there's anything, Andrew, anything else from you? Okay. All right. Well, look, thank you again, everyone. It's been really helpful, and we've covered a lot of ground today and given the panel great food for thought. So thank you very much for your involvement. We're meeting with forums in other states and rural and regional areas as well. So that work will be completed by the end of this week. And then we will do a lot of thinking and a lot of report drafting before our final report, which will be published. Submissions close at the end of October. Then we will work on our report during November, and the final report will be delivered on the 4th of December. So thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you will find our final report helpful. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.